Welcome back to the third session of the day. On behalf of Namita Gokhale, William Dalrymple, Sanjoy Roy, and all my colleagues at JLF Colorado, Timber Cards, Boulder Public Library, and the City of Boulder, we welcome you to this session of JLF Colorado 2021 Virtual Festival. On public madness, why are myths and conspiracy theories so compelling now? Homi K. Bhabha in conversation with Sanjoy K. Roy. Fake news and conspiracy theories have always had a way of nurturing biases. However, the fear unleashed on the world with the pandemic has created fertile ground for the spread of misinformation. Is social media at fault for this development? Or is this a mere consequence of platform? Have people truly become more gullible? Or has the world we live in made it easier to believe in toxic myths? Academic and writer Homi K. Bhabha speaks to Sanjoy Roy about this new era of excessive information and the reasons behind its compelling nature. Introducing our speakers for today, Homi K. Bhabha is the Anne F. Rothenberg Professor of the Humanities in the English and Comparative Literature departments at Harvard University. He was the founding director of the Mahindra Humanities Center at Harvard University from 2011 to 2019. Bhabha is the author of numerous works exploring post-colonial theory, cultural change and power, contemporary art, and cosmopolitanism. In 2019, he was honored by the Institute of Contemporary Art in London for his influential work in studies of colonialism, post-colonialism, and globalization. He was awarded the Government of India's Padma Bhushan Presidential Award in the field of literature and education in 2012 and received the Humboldt Research Prize in 2015. Sanjoy K. Roy, an entrepreneur of the arts, is the managing director of Timber Cards, which produces over 33 highly acclaimed performing arts, visual arts, and literary festivals in 40 cities across the world, including the iconic annual Jaipur Literature Festival, international editions of JLF, and the launched during lockdown digital series JLF Brave New World. He is a founder trustee of Salam Balak Trust, providing support service for street and working children in Delhi. Roy works closely with various industry bodies and the government on policy issues in the cultural sector in India and has lectured and collaborated with leading international universities. Do follow our social media handles to get notifications on upcoming sessions. In these difficult times, we have struggled to bring you JLF Colorado 2021 without charging a registration fee. Please support as generously as you can to ensure a free, seamless, and continuous flow of information and knowledge. Simply click on the Support JLF option button on the right-hand side of your screen. Your contribution is greatly appreciated. Ladies and gentlemen, now presenting On Public Madness, why are myths and conspiracy theories so compelling now? Homi K. Bhabha in conversation with Sanjoy K. Roy. Sanjoy, over to you.
Thank you so much, Suraj. And Professor Bhabha, welcome. You are in Boston, Cambridge, and I'm sitting at an airport in Milan. This is part of an ongoing series that you and I have been doing for a while now. I think this is the fourth or fifth in the series, and I hope we continue our conversation and our search for perhaps some truths that make sense of the world in your eyes. I'm going to start by asking you straight up, is there anything called excessive information?
I don't think, Sanjoy, that excessive information is a term that I would go with. And by the way, in answering your question, let me thank you for these extended conversations, which I think have helped me to think quite deeply about the problem of interpretation, knowledge, and information. And they're not all the same things. I don't think one can either politically or intellectually talk about the excessive nature of information. Information is always going to be excessive so long as people are free to express their opinions and as long as people are free to have their interpretations. I think the problem really lies in the fact that when information is unleavened, when information is not provided with a framework of a larger understanding, it becomes erratic, it becomes anarchic, and it allows people to hold on to the one leg of an argument while not being able to see the rest of the body. So I think from that point of view, we are in a very difficult position. There's no way of restricting free speech or the free dissemination of information, but we demand, and unfortunately our demand is not often heard, that institutions should be much more aware of the effects and the causalities of the information that they circulate. This is, of course, at the moment, a very, very current problem, as we have seen in the United States just over the last couple of days.
I'm going to just jump in there, and you talked about free, and you talked about do institutions or are institutions aware of their responsibility and the cause and effect of any information going out. Now, Professor Bhabha, we know that propaganda comes in so many different ways. Propaganda is not new. Propaganda has always been an instrument of state by so many invading generals. And you see it whether it's in Russia today or in China or South Korea or America. How can you make that differentiation between propaganda and false news? Is there a differentiation between propaganda and false news?
Well, I mean, you hit on something that I was going to say right at the head of our discussion, which is that we have taken this very provocative title on public madness, which I proposed to you, which I rather like, and I believe in the provocation. But I think that issue, that title itself, goes to the heart of what you're saying about propaganda. The tail wagging the dog, as in that famous movie, Wag the Dog. I think that there's a profound infrastructural problem here. And that has to do with the perilous state of democratic institutions and democratic outcomes today. Many of the countries and many of the leaders who foster an extreme form of propaganda through social media and other forms of hacking. Hacking is also a form of propaganda. Misdirection is also a form of propaganda. Many of these leaders now are symptoms of a major shift, as I said. The major shift is people needed to trust their governments and their leaders. That trust has been so badly abused that now people want to cling on to a belief, not in a principle, not in an institution, but in a leader who they feel will make their problems and their concerns and their anxieties disappear. This shift from democratic trust to a kind of quasi-totalitarian belief, the need to just believe in the person, is, I think, a huge step backwards. And when we talk about conspiracy theories today, about people believing in the middle of August that somehow on the 16th of August, Trump would be reinstated, or on January the 6th, people believing in America profoundly that the election had been stolen. When we believe in those, when we see those things, we've also got to think of ways in which the trust has been eroded internationally and globally. The trust is eroded around the issue of weapons of mass destruction. If you think of the simple domino effect of what happened, which started in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, that most of a region, a huge and old and important region of the world, has been destroyed on the basis of what was a myth that even the UN stood by, then you can understand that people who believe that Trump will be reinstated, or people who believe that Mr. Modi's plea that, at 9 o'clock or 8 o'clock every evening, say your prayers and COVID will not hurt you. These conspiracy beliefs, conspiracy ideas have to be placed in the context, in the scale of these larger governmental abuses of democratic trust.
So I'm going to stay with that. You've talked about trust, and you've talked about the betrayal of trust, and you've talked about democracy. Now, if you look at the fact that America, or mostly any power who was part of the WMD debacle, was never held to account, as we're seeing even in the case of Afghanistan, where no government is really being held to account, certainly not America, let alone the United Nations or the United Kingdoms or the forces. And put this in perspective, Homi, with what you said about individuals. If you go back to Mark Antony's mythical speech in Julius Caesar, where he sways the crowd and he carries the crowd with him completely to the other extreme. And he tells the crowd what? I've not come to praise Caesar, I've come to bury him. But by the end of that, he ensures that the crowd goes on a rampage, which is obviously followed by civil war. And the rest, as they say, is history as Shakespeare wrote it and as Roman history. So how do you make that differentiation? You're talking about a very unique world, a very perfect world where in a democracy, everybody has a unique responsibility, which they take on board and they feel that they are accountable to it. But in essence, democracy is, as you and I know, a messy business. It neither gives you the result that people like you and I may wish for, which then brings us to the point of that, is the result that you and I wish for, is that the right result? Or if you look at the Fox Newses or in India, the alternatives like the Republic TVs, etc., is their reality, which seems to be much more in the Mark Antony form of trying to drive a people in a particular manner. Is that the reality? Because the majority seems to be buying into it, as they did in America or they've done in many other parts of the world.
Well, I think, Sanjoy, we've got to make a distinction between the politics of a kind of Caesar, Julius Caesar and that whole kind of political context, and the, hundreds of years of the nurturing of democratic institutions, education, governments, voting practices, etc., etc. I think that we have to make a distinction there. But you're right. As much as I want to see a distinction between demagoguery and democracy, following on from what you said, why is demagoguery now the prime form of the construction of a community or an audience? And here, I think the important thing about democracy, if I may just for a moment respond to you, it is, of course, individual freedom. Yes, of course, that is true. And the freedom not only to speak, but the freedom to act, the freedom to organize, the freedom to protest, and the freedom to set yourself up with your own party to be elected or not to be elected. But I think what we have lost of the democratic process, and I go back to my question of trust between parties of different political opinions, and trust what? Trust is not that people of the left or the right should believe in each other, but they should believe in each other's ability to negotiate with each other. If you think of the world order today, when we talk about polarization, the real problem is negotiation. The real problem is not simply that people have different ideological perspectives. They refuse to come to the table in a spirit which goes beyond their party political ambitions. That's the problem. The problem is of negotiation. Democracy is about negotiation. Otherwise, you have revolution. That's what I believe is now lacking. The good faith in negotiation, accepting the fact that your opponent does have a series of coherent beliefs. The other problem, of course, is that the state of education, particularly the state of education, and I would say across the world, on humanistic problems, which absolutely stress the fact that democracy is dialogical. Democracy is about conflict and about dealing with that conflict. That sense of civility has been sacrificed by the parties in power themselves. And that's where the demagogic becomes the only way to sway opinion, to appeal to passion, rather than to forms of negotiated public reason. Now, the fact is,
Homi, let me hold you there for 1 second. You're talking about public reason. Can you also extend or expand to say, what role does education or an educated, considered public have in this cross-fertilization of information that we're talking about that's leading, as we say, to this public madness? So include that in your expansion.
I think there are two very important issues in the time we have. One is an education that prepares people for citizenship. Very important. Whatever your specialism might be, whatever contribution you might make, to prepare you for the sense of citizenly dialogue, negotiation, and some sense of the construction of a commonality which is workable with. We begin to see here again and again that commonalities are not workable with. So I think an education based on a notion of citizenship and civility. Secondly, I think the most important issue is that education has to integrate humanistic values, ethical values into scientific and professional thinking. I think that's a very important issue.
But I'm going to move forward to, again, public madness as a concept and ask you, Black Lives Matter, for example, is something that's sort of swept not just the United States, but it's swept much of the world. How do you place this in context of information, the way it's being used, and the way that you see it being used occasionally for good?
I think Black Lives Matter has had the impact that it has had because it seized the moment in which George Floyd was murdered by the police. And it saw that moment initially in the United States as a mirror of a whole range of other inequities, as a whole range of other unethical behaviors on the part of the state. And it did not simply say that, well, in a melancholic way, this is, of course, something we always expect. We've known this for 200 years. It actually seized the moment, short though it was, and it used it to create all kinds of cultural, artistic, and political fronts. And I think that's what we need. To use the old word, we need to seize the moment and not simply to sit back and say, until we change the whole structure of society, we will never be able to make any progress at all. I think this is very important, that a short, sharp period moment can be used as a kind of a major magnifying glass. And the fact that it is short, and the fact that it was one person, and that person was in one city in the United States, and the person himself was not a person of note. This was not a Mandela figure. This was not a Gandhi figure. This was not this was somebody whose anonymity allowed people from all over the world to think about that moment in a symbolic way. Do you see what I'm saying? It was not the old kind of heroism. If he had been Martin Luther King being assassinated, then it would have been a very different thing. But the anonymity of the moment allowed people to take that moment, take it into very different areas of the social system and its problems, and allowed them on that anonymity to project themselves across the world.
So Homi, you talk about anonymity, and that in many ways is the power of social media, where being anonymous or being in in many ways without name or face, you're being able to take on the powers that be and be both critical as well as be, what we call trolls. How has anonymity therefore come to define this new paradigm that we're talking about? And how has anonymity led to the public madness that we are debating today?
Sanjoy, I think there are different forms of anonymity. There is the anonymity of the troll who hides behind an anonymity in order to create and stir up chaos and problematic political beliefs, where that anonymity is of a very different kind of an anonymity where you are not a celebrity and yet you want to collect people together around an idea. That's one of the great contributions of Black Lives Matter. There were 3 women who started it. They refused to have a leadership structure. People questioned that. They criticized that. They said that doesn't matter. We want to have constellations of Black Lives Matter across the states and across the world, where there are individuals, there are groups in those places who actually define the politics of those places. That's why you now have Palestinian Lives Matter, you have Dalit Lives Matter, you have a whole movement. So I think there is a way in which the best of anonymity is to draw attention to groups, to actual moments in real time, which have huge significance, and not to create celebrities, whether they're celebrities of one kind or another. I think the problem with the trolling anonymity is very often that it is hiding something. The advantage of something like Black Lives Matter in its various avatars is to put something out there, to make anonymity visible as a human condition.
I'm going to go back to where we started. Homi, is there anything called a surfeit or excessive news? And now I want to ask you this question in context of the pandemic. We're still in the midst of the pandemic, even as vaccination is rolling out across the world, or at least in some parts of the world that has access to vaccination. There's a lot of research that continues to go on. The impact and the effect of COVID-19 is still not known. The impact and effect of the many mutations that have followed are still not known. The impact and effect of the vaccination, as we see it, is still not entirely known. And yet, it's primarily because of the free flow of knowledge and information between universities, researchers, the medical fraternity, and the world around, that in the first time in history, have you been able to roll out a vaccine to a major pandemic in a year? And how then does this flow of information and this rapid understanding of what was happening in the world, how does that sort of, in your sense, flow through? And I'm going to put a caveat there. Remember when the first cases were discovered in Wuhan, and the rest of us across the world were like, oh, that's for China, not realizing that at some point of time, COVID, or the virus, like most other things, doesn't need a passport and could escape. So even in this excessive information, we were all fairly isolated because we wanted to imagine our isolation. Similarly, when you looked at the second and third wave that swept Europe and continues to sweep through America, there was a sense of we are now immune despite all the warnings. How does information play a role here?
I think to answer that question, we have to take a more sober view. You're absolutely right that the vaccine has been produced in remarkable time and distributed in an unprecedented way. I have no quarrel with that whatsoever. When you have viruses, then you know that other forms of these viruses will emerge, and nobody can say, as you've said a moment ago, how sustained the recovery from COVID can be. But think about, when we think about the positive side of that, think about just 2 instances, or 3 maybe, of the negative side of that. We know that the Chinese sat on the information for 3 weeks or 4 weeks. The doctor who first talked about it committed suicide, and the entire city was affected. We know for sure that in India too, in terms of the purchasing of the vaccine, and please correct me if I'm wrong, and indeed in dealing with with COVID, the information was instrumentalized, as it was in China. And in the United States too, there was a political wrangle here, because the CDC was saying we're in a very difficult position, but those around Trump and his advisors did not want to convey the bad news to him. So I think there was like a 4-week delay between knowing that this was an emergency and actually making it known to the public that it was a crisis. So when we talk about, the value of people in the social media talking about it and scientists exchanging information, it's very interesting to know how the battle was completely lost before it was won. And I think that when we talk today about the notion of information, about the question of democracy, Sanjoy, we have to remember that what we have been living with for as far as the pandemic goes, and as far as police violence goes, or racial violence goes, over the last year and a half, is the fact not only of disease, it's not only of injustice, it's the fact of death.
So Homi, I've got a slew of questions coming in, but I'm going to ask you one last and then go to the questions. And that's, if you look at the toxicity today, and you talked about responsibility and cause and effect of institutions, if you look at the toxicity that surrounds the vaccination program, and that has had a huge impact, especially in the southern states in the United States, for example, where the anti-vaxxers, or even in France to some extent, till they realized they couldn't get into a restaurant or a cafe without their vaccination certificate, and that got them all to take their vaccination. But look at the issue that we've had with Big Pharma. Big Pharma has not been held responsible in the past for many of their ills, and as you and I know, the ills are numerous. And then when they come up with also, this is the holy grail, and this is what you need, the toxicity that pushed back against that was enormous. Is that one of the reasons why you feel the failing of governments and institutions to take action and take responsibility? Is that a primary reason or a primary cause for people to lose trust? I mean, coming back to your whole issue of trust.
I believe so. And I think the erosion of trust has been coming for a long time, as you said, with propaganda. We can go back eons, to the whole fear of the atom bomb, etc., etc. Baldwin said very clearly that the anti-Russian sentiment in America, he said, where parents frightened their children to say, if you don't go to bed like they did with Napoleon Bonaparte, the Russians are coming. Those kinds of things have been have had a long history. But I do feel there is a dramatic loss of trust in ideas and institutions, in specialisms, in governments, and people want to replace it by kind of small boutique, let me put it that way, boutique faith in this figure or that figure or this date or that date or this prayer. pray every Thursday and this won't affect you. So I think that there is a whole scalar problem. Yes, conspiracies have been there for a long time, but when you live through them, as we have now, and I have to stress this again, with morbidity and mortality happening at the same time, the scale is very different. And the social media makes that scale different. And there are positive forms of anonymity, and there are negative forms of celebrity involved in this equation. And when there is polarization, which, as I said, is not about opposing ideas, it's about the resistance to negotiate opposing ideas. I think you're right. If I put all that together, we are in a bad way.
Homi, I'm going to ask you a few quick questions. We're running out of time. You'll have to keep the answers really short because I want to get through as many of these questions as possible. Ami Dayan from Boulder, Colorado asks, what is preventing a fact-based defense system making any public assertions subject to fact-checking and making it illegal, plain and simple, to spread lies? Whether it's climate change is a myth, COVID is a hoax, Trump won, etc. Saying the elections were stolen should be seen as libel, plain and simple. What is preventing this?
I think it's very simple. What prevents it is the very nature of the fact. Because as soon as you say this is a fact, somebody says, whose fact is this? And very often the notion of facticity is itself problematic. There can be facts that speak to each other in some ways and don't in other ways. There can be incongruent facts, depending on the question you ask, which is why I say the important ethical, political, and social issue is negotiation between these. If you don't, but you cannot depend entirely on fact checking. As we know, Trump was fact checked every day. The results were disastrous, but very often people said, yes, there are facts here and then there are facts there and we don't know where we go. So I think the problem is with the status of the fact. That's a longer philosophical discussion.
The whataboutery that we see today, that every time an argument is presented and the whataboutery around it is just so complicated. But here Kabir asks, if misdirection is propaganda, more intentional and precise than imagined, then it has the power to permeate social groups and systems subtly, stealthily, and insidiously. How is misdirection rooted in the teaching of history and educational systems? How does the use of means to spread myth and frenzy affect this?
Well, I think Kabir has his answer already in the fact that from what I understand, and my facts may be wrong, just to go back to it, in Britain, there is an attempt to try and teach as little about the British history of empire as possible. In India, as I understand it, there is a kind of rewriting of textbooks to reflect particular political and cultural and religious views. In my sense is that what this creates is a continual sense not of personhood and people, but of groupishness. The adherence to the creation, the imagination of an educational system based on groups and based on the lack of trust. So I think that the answer is actually, in terms of education, the answer is obvious. People are actually now effecting these forms of knowledge, which are very often motivated and determined by particular outcomes rather than by a really rigorous study of the situation.
I'm going to throw a last question to you, Homi, and let me apologize to Ben and Jesse and all the others that I have not been able to take your question. But Kenny asks, Homi, the sense of security you discuss seems so very precarious. If modern politics are shaped, enabled, and implemented on the basis of myth and intrinsic hollowness, what was the nature of this past security now irrevocably damaged?
Well, it's a very important question. I want to thank all our questioners, and I'm sure there are many others who you are not able to bring into this discussion. So my apologies for that. I think that I think that the question of security is a very important question. Kenny, let's just look at the past 20 years. In terms of security, and I know I'm taking this word a little bit away from the way you pose it, I think many of the issues we've been discussing post 9/11 have actually been based on a new sense of insecurity, which has very important cultural and educational manifestations. People no longer ask, what is the Islamic notion of political martyrdom? People say, in an Islamophobic way, my God, you come from a culture which encourages killing, a complete misrepresentation. So in a way, the whole notion of the security of the West, the security of the nation, surveillance, has changed the very contours of knowledge and discussion. And at the everyday level, as I said a moment ago, the idea is not who are you, but if I let you into my country, will you kill? Not what will you do? What do you do? What do you want to do? But if I let you in as a refugee or a migrant, will you throw my country into an economic peril because you will demand so much? The question of security, my dear Kenny, is an ethical question. And indeed, at the same time, it is a question of hospitality. It has changed the way we think about neighbors and strangers and neighboring countries at a time when we have over 80 million displaced people in the world. And 80 million displaced people, I never tire of saying, are the size of a mid-level European country, bigger than many. They may not have a nation, but they live amongst us as a peoples. And I think the notion of security, and I know I'm shifting it a little bit from where you talked, from where you said, I think the notion of national security, national hegemony, creates a sense of this form of precariousness, vulnerability, and anxiety. And unfortunately, our current ethno-nationalist governments thrive on that. They thrive on that.
Sadly, Homi, there is, what you talked about security and people coming in and governments questioning their role in their countries. Sadly, when they're displaced, primarily in the last few decades, they've been displaced because of the geopolitics of the moment and the fact that nation countries like the United States and their allies have gone in uninvited to many countries and displaced the communities there, which have then led to this entire migration and a falling out in an economic disaster. It's the hypocrisy that we see around us is just incredible. Unfortunately, time has run out. Jesse Friedman asks solutions to counter propaganda. I'm going to sum up what Homi is saying. What we have to do is education. We must have education. It is the responsibility, I think, of each and every one of us, whether it's people on this platform or outside, to have a sense of considered information, to do their own research, make sure that they're seeing as many perspectives as possible and arriving at that one truth, which is not necessarily the only truth. We have to move between my way and the highway, but we also have to move to understand that there is a responsibility and we have to hold to account our governments, corporations, and other who are responsible for information as we're seeing it. Homi,
May I
Bhabha,
just say one thing, the importance, as you agree with, or you summarized it beautifully, but that negotiation and freedom is about negotiating across the aisle. It's about negotiating across differences. And that's the basis of freedom.
Homi Bhabha, thank you so much. I do hope the senators and the congressmen in the Capitol will hear you in terms of negotiations and crossing the divide, I hope they will hear across the world. Always a pleasure to speak with you. Apologies for having dropped out in between. This is the vagaries when you're between many cities and many time zones. But thank you so much. Look forward to our continued conversations. Apologies to all of you who've been listening in and sending questions, which I haven't been able to take. Suraj, Dhingra, back to you.
Thank you, Sanjoy. You came back like a phoenix.
Professor Bhabha, Sanjoy, thank you so much for that brilliant conversation, giving stimulating insights on the current era of fake news and excessive information.
Thank you so much.
Some of those internet issues. Thank you for being part of JLF Colorado 2021 virtual series. And Professor Bhabha, as I mentioned earlier, would love to receive you in person for JLF Colorado 2022. Thank you all for watching and being a great audience. We encourage you to buy the books of our speakers that are available at the Boulder Bookstore. If you like the session, do consider supporting us through the Support JLF option button on the right-hand side of your screen. We sincerely value your contributions. Once again, we'd like to thank all our official partners, advisory and board members, supporters, donors, patrons, and friends of the festival. We hope you all enjoy these conversations and will tune back in for our next session, The Roots of a Nation. Fali S. Nariman, introduced by Tripul Daman Singh, at 2 p.m. Mountain Time, 3 p.m. Central Time, 4 p.m. Eastern Time, and 1:30 a.m. Indian Standard Time. Thank you once again, and now presenting a reading from the JLF Writer Short series by Adishri Kasliwal. Enjoy.
Hi, my name is Adishri Kasliwal. I'm a 15-year-old girl currently studying in class 10, and I'm here to talk about my book, Quarantine Diaries. The book is about my experience in life as a COVID-19 patient. So first, let's talk about why I wrote this book. When I first learned that I had contracted the coronavirus, I was scared. I didn't know what would happen now or this meant for me. I could not talk about it to anyone. I could not even tell my closest friends I had the virus. Honestly, it wasn't the illness that scared me, it was the stigma that had developed in my mind that made me fear. I had been working with SMS Medical College to spread awareness about plasma donation. So going to the hospital, visiting the plasma bank, talking to recovered patients had become a part of my daily routine. But what I didn't understand then is what those patients go through, not only physically, but mentally. I used to talk to a lot of recovered patients every day. But at times when I used to call them, they would be too scared to even accept that they have the virus. This at that time really confused me. But now I understand what it feels like. I mean, we hear people telling us to sanitize our hands, wear a mask, maintain social distancing, and all the ways how not to get the virus. But what happens when you actually do get the virus? Who is there to guide us then? Which is the reality actually. Thousands and lakhs of people are testing positive every day. So that's when I decided I cannot be afraid anymore. I want to tell the world about my experience. I am not afraid or ashamed anymore. Because if no one addresses this stigma, this fear, it's just going to continue. So here I am telling the world that yes, I had the coronavirus. This is my book, Quarantine Diaries. Now I would like to read an extract from the book, which is really personal, really close to my heart. Day 8. Today the results of my test are going to come. I have a strong feeling that I will step out of my room and have lunch with my family. During my breakfast break from online school, my mom asked me what I would like to have for lunch. So I asked her, could I come for lunch today? But she said I could not, as the test results had come and I was still positive. I was heartbroken. I told my mother I didn't want to talk about it and she should leave. I could not take it anymore. I was done. I was expecting to be free today. Then she explained to me how fortunate I was to be quarantined at home and not in some hospital. She told me I should be happy that I'm healthy, not in a critical stage. That made me realize how foolish I was to crib about my situation. I am COVID positive. So what? I'm still able to attend online school, eat home cooked meals, video call my relatives and talk to my parents and sister. The quote that I think sums up all the learnings that I had during this experience is the one at the back of my book. The four walls of your room can teach you more than you would expect. Thank you.
festival like this is a beautiful indication of the kind of thing that I truly, truly believe in, and I think makes our society more whole and more pure.
We do not take it for granted that Boulder was chosen as the first North American satellite festival. It's a huge honor we will not forget, and we are enriched because of it. We are indebted to both the local and international people that came together to make that happen, and we hope it's a tradition that continues for decades to come.
Literary festivals like this one build up an environment and an ecosystem to nurture readers and to promote the business of books. They provide an invaluable forum for writers to connect with other creative people.
We sit there peering into those electronic grids in front of our eyes, and it only increases the desire to see the real thing in the flesh, to actually hear an author speak firsthand, to read from their work, to hear the tones of their voice modulate as they read their most treasured passages of prose.
For us, it's special. This was our mothership, and it continues to be. The other editions that we have across the United States are smaller versions, different programming, but smaller versions.
In a sense, to me, religion and art are the same thing. They're vaguely irrational, but they help make sense of things. Someone who lives with no arts and no religion has very little to live on.
2019 was the 14th consecutive year of decline in global freedom.
You have to think of viruses as intelligent machines, as code crackers. And like all living forms, they have to adapt to their environment.
Imagination is a powerful tool. It doesn't matter which part of the world we are in our situation. Are we behind locked bars? Are we roaming freely? Independent thought and process. Our imagination allows us to soar out of any present circumstances that we find ourselves in. And that really is the power of literature and the written word. It allows us to envision a better future. It allows us to consider our past and make sense of the present. Imagination is a tool to be able to free us from the binds and the constrictions that we find ourselves locked into. We can break free. We can soar through the universe. We can rise up into the darkened night like a firefly, illuminating the world. This is what JLF Boulder, Colorado hopes to bring you, something to fire your imagination.